Okay, so for our last substantive video, why am I playing this song? You guys know the song? Kind of older, Lady Gaga. Why am I playing I Was Born This Way? Well, the reason is, for the last substantive video of class today, we're going to talk about an interesting set of findings that suggest your happiness level might be predetermined. In other words, you're born that way. There are researchers like Lycan and Telegram who have argued. Now, Lycan is no longer alive. He passed away a few years ago. But he was a pretty forceful figure in psychology. And he did some research with his colleague Telegram to indicate we are born, quote, we are born with a predetermined level of happiness. And we're destined to remain within a narrow range above and below that level. So how did they come up with this? A study of twins concludes trying to be happier may be, quote, as futile as trying to be taller. Well, what were they saying here? They were saying, just like your genetics determines the potential to be a certain height, and then environment can move you somewhat, but only within that range. Like, for example, if your genetics indicate that you can be as tall as 5'6", environment will determine whether you reach your fullest height potential genetically or whether you fall short of that. But you're not ever going to be 6'5" because you don't have the genetics for that. Similarly, they're arguing here that we inherit genes that determine our range of potential happiness, and environmental circumstances can impact where we are in that range. But if we're predetermined to only be moderately happy, that's the happiest we can get, and maybe lower than that, but we're not going to be extremely happy. Well, that probably sounds pretty depressing. Like, shit, what if I was born with the unhappy genes? Well, let me tell you a little more about their studies. The study that I was just mentioning here, the quote from, they found that socioeconomic status, the amount of education people had, their family income, their marital status, and their contentment, religiously speaking, if they were religiously affiliated, accounted for less than 3% of variation across individuals in subjective well-being over time. So whether you had high SES or low SES, socioeconomic status, whether you had high levels of education or low levels of education, whether your family made a lot of money or not a lot of money, whether you were married or unmarried, whether you were religious or not religious, that accounted for a very small percentage in why some people are happier than others. They correlated through what are called concordance rates. These are a statistical measure of how often two people share the same characteristic. So, for example, we can compare identical twins who share all of their genetics, fraternal twins who share half of their genetics, distant relatives like second cousins or third cousins, right? All the way down to friends that you're not related to. And the idea of concordance rate studies is the more genetically related you are to somebody, the more likely you should be to share the characteristics they share if those characteristics are genetically influenced. So the idea here is, if happiness levels have a genetic predetermination, then identical twins should be more concordant, meaning more similar in their levels of happiness than fraternal twins, and fraternal twins should be more concordant in their levels of happiness than, say, strangers or second cousins, right? What they found was, if you measure subjective well-being scores at one point in time and then 10 years later, the correlation for identical twins is around 50%, but just about zero for fraternal twins. In another study, the same researchers showed the same correlations of identical and fraternal twins who were not raised in the same home. This is one of the most powerful ways to establish genetic heritability. Identical twins, same genetic structure, same DNA, not raised in the same environment, so you can separate genes from environment. In that study, they found still subjective well-being scores were around 52% for identical twins and 0 for fraternal twins. So it seems to be the case, they argued, that what they call trait happiness, meaning a consistent, stable happiness level in people that defines them, they're happy people or unhappy people or moderately happy people, is a heritable characteristic, a genetically heritable characteristic. Excuse me. Twin studies have also found that identical twins' levels of positive emotions, positive affect, tend to be closer to each other than fraternal twins' average levels of positive emotions or affect. And fraternal twins share about as much positive affect concordance as total strangers. And it doesn't matter if the twins were raised together or apart. So again, the story is there's clearly a genetic component to happiness, well-being, and positive emotionality. Because the more genes you share with somebody, the more concordant your levels of those things are, even if you don't grow up together. So to end class today, let's take a look at slide number 19. So is this true? Are there happy genes? And if you're an unfortunate soul who didn't get the happy genes, you're destined to be, at best, moderately amused, moderately happy. Research comparing identical and fraternal twins, according to Lycan and colleagues, they argue that we have something called a happiness set point, a happiness set point. So what does that mean? They argue that just like some researchers have suggested, we have a genetically inherited weight set point, a certain weight that our body wants to stabilize at, and that's why it's hard for some people to lose or gain weight. They argue we have a happiness set point, meaning we have a genetically inherited baseline or potential for happiness or optimal level of happiness functioning to which we tend to return even after major setbacks or triumphs. So the idea is that, look, happiness levels might, change very temporarily in response to events, but eventually, regardless of what happens to us, we go back to that set point that is genetically predetermined. And so you can have two people who have the same exact experiences, but the one who is born with a higher happiness set point will return to a higher level of happiness, positive emotionality, and feelings of well-being than the person who was born with a lower happiness set point. By the way, they argue this works in both directions. People who are born, they argue, with a lower happiness set point will return to that lower level of happiness, even if they have some good things happen to them. It won't change their set point, is what they're saying here. They say because of this, some people have to work harder or less hard to increase their happiness levels, depending on their set point, just like weight. Their argument is, if you're born into the world with a genetically lower weight set point, then it's easier for you to lose weight and maintain lower weight. If you're born into the world with a higher weight set point, it's harder to lose weight and easier to gain weight. So they really liken this to weight loss and metabolism. They're treating it like the same kind of genetically determined thing. They estimated between 50 and 80% of variability across different people in happiness levels is genetically predetermined or heritable, not based on experiences. They said some people are genetically predisposed to experience positive feelings more strongly too. So not just whether or not you experience them at all, which is also, they argue, genetically determined, but how strongly and how long those feelings will last. They claim that trying to make yourself happier by changing your environment, whether that means changing your job, advancing in your career, making more money, getting married, whatever, it's too futile because genetics ultimately determines the set point to which you're going to return. Before I end, I just want to make sure I told you everything that I wanted to tell you about this. I did want to introduce, I should say this because this language is important. I did want to introduce the concept of genotype and phenotype here, just to make sure we're all on the same page. So the heritability piece is the genotype, the genes that the DNA that you literally inherit. Phenotype are the observable characteristics that we think could be influenced to some extent by that DNA. So when we say happiness is heritable, the argument is your genotype encodes something genetically that drives your potential for happiness. And then the phenotype is what we're measuring to determine how happy you are. Okay. So that is an important thing to talk about. And the idea is that from the research perspective of Lichen and colleagues, identical twins have that shared genotype. And we look then at their concordance with regard to the phenotype. How happy are they reporting themselves to be, and how consistent across the twins is that phenotypic measurement. Okay, so I wanted to throw that out there. Very important with these kinds of studies. So I leave you thinking about this for next class. Do you think there are problems with the kind of research that Lichen and colleagues did and the conclusions they're drawing from it? What could be some problems with the way they measured this? What are some reservations you have about drawing conclusions on the basis of these studies that, hey, well, whatever your genes are determine if you're going to be happy or a miserable fuck. So, ooh, I said the F-bomb. But, you know, are they right that we're sort of slaves to our genes and we're either going to be really happy no matter what the hell happens to us, or we're going to be really miserable no matter what the hell happens to us? I really want you guys to think about this. And we're going to come back to this next class. But think about this research. Anything about it that you want to know more to really decide if you think it has validity? Are there some shortcomings to it? What else would you want to study to really get the answer here?